straight enough for you?
anything else you need?
אולי אני אחזיק, כן, כי אני צריך לפנות עליו, כי הוא צריך לראות אותי תוך כדי. לא, אני אחזיק, זה בסדר. ואז אני גם יכול לשחק, כי הקור שלי מאוד חזק, והקור שלו מאוד חלש, אז זה מצוין. Is it whiskey?
Sorry?
Is it whiskey?
No, it looks like it, especially if I have it in a brown paper bag.
Okay.
I never know whether there's going to be water. I should actually hide it somewhere.
No. It looks really good. It looks like you have a taste.
דני שלנו, אנחנו יכולים להתחיל?
מאיה, מתי אני אמור לעבור לשאלות?
How long would you like this to last?
It's up to you, but there should be.
So, whatever you prefer.
רגע זה נופל. מאיה?
I'd like to welcome you all, and it's nice that when I look around, I don't see only the faces of the usual suspects. This is indeed a very varied audience, and if the overflow will be about 20, we have another hall reserved downstairs, but if this is it, then maybe we will stay here. I have been asked often in the past few days, how did the Center of Rationality manage to bring Oliver Sacks to Israel? Well, the Center of Rationality did not bring Oliver Sacks to Israel. A family event brought Oliver Sacks to Israel, and we are very fortunate that this family, besides having a member who is celebrating her 100th birthday, also includes our own Israel Aumann. So the Shoshbin, as they say, the matchmaker in this case was Israel Aumann, and I am happy to give him the microphone for the introductions.
Okay, Dr. Sacks needs no introduction. But I'll just say about 20 years ago, my son Jonathan was reading. We were visiting New York at the same time. We were at a different cousin's house, and Jonathan was reading a book, and he said, "This book, this is really interesting." Yeah, and it was the man who mistook his wife for a hat. And I said, "Okay, I'll read it," and I was really fascinated by it. And then I said, "Oliver Sacks, who's that?" And so on and so forth. And finally, somehow, I don't remember how, I realized that it's a cousin. In fact, Oliver is the reason that one doesn't place it so easily is because he's a cousin of my mother, not of me. First cousin of my mother. My mother's father was the first of 18 children. And Oliver's mother is the 16th, right? of the 18 children. So there are lots of cousins around, yeah. Not all are like Oliver, but many are quite distinguished people. Lots of distinguished people in this family. Oliver wrote a book called Uncle Tungsten, mainly about the family. He also mentioned my grandfather. Let me conclude with this. When my brother Moshe, who's sitting right here, and I were young, a little younger than now, when we were children in the United States, we listened in 1940 to the radio broadcast of the national conventions of the Republican and the Democratic parties. And in the National Convention of the Democratic Party, there was speaker after speaker, senators, governors, and they would be introduced at length. The man who did this, remember Moshe? And the man who did that, the man who was educated there, and the man who, and there was lengthy invitations. And then the announcer came on and said, after the previous speech, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States." So I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, Oliver Sacks. Oh, just a moment, but Mr. Professor Chamovitz may need an introduction. Professor Chamovitz is a professor at of botany, I think, at Tel Aviv University, and he wrote an article in Scientific American called "Sentient Plants," and this caught Oliver's attention for good reason, apparently. And they've been corresponding, so we asked Professor Chamovitz to interview Oliver.
Thanks. This is incredible honor, especially this is where I did my PhD on this campus, and it's great to be back here. So, Oliver, we're going to talk a lot about perceptions and reality, but let's start with two personal questions. One, it's been 60 years since you've last been in Israel. So how's your perception of Israel changed from 1955 to 2014?
Well, I haven't got around much yet, but I will. It's there are far more people here. There's far more traffic. There's far more caution, and. When I came in 55, I spent 3 months on a kibbutz near Haifa, En HaShofet, although I used to annoy them by calling it En HaShochet. My grandfather, your great-grandfather, was a shochet, among many other things, as well as being a very good amateur mathematician who donated his genes to Robert John, but unfortunately not to me. Things seemed rather pure and simple and idealistic then, and I think they're probably not quite so pure or simple or idealistic, but there've been wonderful achievements. Architectural, I think, are the ones which have immediately hit me, and but I'm not sure yet.
All right, we'll come back to that next week then.
Right, yeah.
And so I have a personal question. Maybe you can solve a problem that happened in our family. My father made Aliyah at age 60. Didn't know a word of Hebrew. 6 years of Ulpan, didn't know a word of Hebrew. Oh, the microphone. So my father made Aliyah at age 60. 6 years of Ulpan, still didn't know any Hebrew. At age 74, he went in for back surgery. Woke up in the recovery room. I was there with him. My sister was there with me. And my father spoke fluent Hebrew. 20 minutes later, he didn't know a word of Hebrew. Can you explain this?
Well, I'm not sure that I can explain it, but I have known many parallels to this, including one when I woke from anesthesia myself after some eye surgery in 2005, and they wanted to check to see whether I knew where I was and what had happened, and they said, do you know what you've had? And I said, yes, I had a plaque of radioactive iodine in my eye, and it was I-125, and that's the smallest number, which is the sum of two squares. Now, I didn't intend to say this, and I didn't know this. And in fact, when I mentioned the episode of Robert John, he said, you're incorrect. But I was also exuberant. I'm normally rather shy. but I was exuberantly sociable for about half an hour, and then I became my usual inhibited self. But another personal example I was very interested in. By the way, I'm afraid I'm blind in the right eye, and I can't see you over there, but I will try and turn around and be aware of you. I was okay. I was very interested in sign languages and deaf people, although I'm very bad at languages. But I was invited to a deaf social, and they had it was a hot summer day, and they had a drink called punch. I didn't realize it was strongly alcoholic, and I thought it was lemonade, and I drank a great deal of it, and suddenly I, who could not make a single sign, was conversing fluently in sign language. When I became sober, I'd lost it all. I think we are all sort of somewhat suppressed for better or constrained by our frontal lobes for good or worse. And when the constraint is lifted for a while by anesthesia or by alcohol or sometimes by sudden shock. I had an episode in Italy once. I don't speak a word of Italian. I just arrived, I was having a shower, and the light bulb above the shower suddenly exploded and covered me with hot glass. And apparently I burst into fluent Italian curses and maledictions. But then 10 minutes later, when I calmed down, I didn't know a word. So it happens.
All right. So maybe you can then help me understand the relationship with what I'll call physical reality and neurological reality. I'm a scientist, a biologist. I like to think of the words in physical constructs. And physics teaches us that light of the wavelength of about 670 nanometers is red. But as you wrote in The Colorblind Painter, Goethe identified an incompatibility between classical color theory and reality. So how could 700 nanometers not be red for your patient, Mr. I?
Well, it could fail to be red if you're one of the people born partially colorblind with no receptors in the eye for that wavelength. He had all the receptors for all the wavelengths, but the part of his brain which is involved in interpreting and comparing wavelength information and, if you want, in computing or perceiving color, that was missing. But we can be in sort of matching tests. It's probably most people will see a pure spectral red in a given background, more or less identically. But it's often called the hard question, the question of qualia. We don't know how to build any sort of bridge between something which may occur in everyone physiologically and may also occur in almost everyone psychologically, and yet we can't see how the physical world, the objective world, can possibly be translated into the subjective world. But obviously nature has no trouble.
So to define a color, not to perceive a color, but to define it, is a brain then necessary?
Well, I see that you're ready with counterexamples. Some sort of vital organization is necessary because various protozoa and microorganisms which don't have a brain may respond specifically to one color or another. Whether we could say they perceive it or not is another matter. I'm not sure at what level one can speak of perception, although I favor jellyfish. There's a particular jellyfish with highly developed eyes, a lens and a retina, and it's you don't want to get in its sights, because if it has you in its sights, it will go at you. And so I'm inclined, whether it sees color, I'm not sure, but it certainly sees form and shadow.
All right, so you were right. I'm going to take this really far.
I know.
So, so I've written a book that's called What a Plant Knows.
This is how we met.
This
I read this book and it was marvelous, and I wrote to Danny.
And so I say in the book that plants differentiate between red and blue. They do. Plants differentiate between red and blue. And I even describe a mutant plant that's lost the ability to sense blue light. So was I correct in terming this mutant colorblind?
You could use the word, as you could use the word sight, but would have to be used in a very special sense. I take it you don't. I mean, one can be responsive without having a subjective life, whatever one means by that. And in fact, you will have to justify what you mean by colorblind.
We'll come back to that maybe a bit later. But let's go back to human sight. So you mentioned already that you've lost the sight in your right eye, and you have have you had difficulties in adapting to this visual loss? How has this affected your perception of the world?
Well, I'm not immediately conscious of it. My visual field is full, so far as I'm concerned, although I can't see my hand. I am continually surprised by accidents on the right side. I walk into people and things, or they suddenly appear in the central vision of my left eye. I really can't imagine rightness. It's not only affected my visual world, but to some extent the world of imagery and imagination. And have I adapted to it? If I remember, I turn round, but I often don't remember. And so there's no automatic adaptation. There's only a sort of conscious one. I'm not sure how it is, and I need to research this, say, in a cat or a dog who loses one eye.
But in your chapter on it called Seeing Voices, you wrote the remarkable abilities of deaf people to use visual language. And in The Mind's Eye, you talk about the many ways in which blind people compensate for the lack of vision. So what's going on in their brains? Are their brains the same as ours?
Well, if, say, one is born deaf, what would be the auditory cortex for processing sound is reallocated for vision. And this is then fortified by the use of a visio-gestural of sign language, and people born deaf who sign are hypervisual to a great extent. If, on the other hand, one loses one's sight, one tends to become much more sensitive to other cues. And if one is born blind, then the visual cortex, which is half the visual cortex, is entirely turned over to other senses. Nothing is idle in the brain. Everything is used all the time, and for whatever helps the organism survive.
So I have arguments with my wife, whose PhD was in psychology, about the connection then between perceptive cognitive processes and individual experience. You know, we can all see the red light, but we will be seeing it or perceiving it necessarily differently.
Yeah.
Where does the difference come from?
Well, the difference is already there at birth, even in identical twins. In details of neural connection, during fetal life, some cells die, some migrate. So even identical twins are born with somewhat different nervous systems. And then experience will play on them in different ways. And all of us start to become an individual, to have individual perceptions and individual actions from day one, from birth. And and individuality is extremely deep, and even in people with, say, with an advanced dementia, you may find they're still very much themselves, especially their social selves. And so one cannot have, or seemingly, in human beings and mammals generally, although I think this is probably down to the level of jellyfish, I think you cannot have cognitive powers without having a commensurate individuality. They're your perceptions, your acts, your memories, and they're never the same. Each time you remember something, it is retranscribed, it is put in a different context, in a different perspective, and so memory is nothing like photography, nothing like a fixed, in my generation I would say a fixed silver image or whatever. Everything is moving all the while.
I think we'll come back maybe this a bit later, because this touches on mind and individuality. But before we get into this, I want to, still touching on senses, I think many of us whose senses are more or less not compromised tend to believe that we need to restore sight to people who are blind, or allow people who are deaf to hear their children. In other words, maybe, unfortunately calling it to cure them. Can you tell us about your experience with Virgil and how this affects your take on curing people who have lost a sense?
Well, I think if one has lost a sense, one will probably want it back. Although with the colorblind painter whom you mentioned earlier, when 4 years after this, we had a thought that it might be possible to train a different brain region to discriminate colors, he said he didn't want it. He said had we been able to do this a week or two after, he would have sort of said hallelujah and God bless us. But he said after 4 years he had adapted to his world, and color would now be irrelevant. But with regard to someone who is born, who loses a sight or hearing very early, or is born without it, they will make for themselves a complete life with the senses they have. And if you say to someone born blind, would you like sight? It's sort of meaningless, although they might be curious. And certainly with my patient Virgil, who was in effect a congenitally blind man who had a full life as a blind man, but his fiancée insisted that he have some eye surgery. There was a thought that eye surgery might be able, I won't say to restore, but for the first time to give some sight. And it did, and sight caused all sorts of problems. When the bandages were removed from the operated eye, they expected him either to say, to speak of the visual wonder of the world, or to say he saw nothing. But in fact, there was no reaction. And it was only when the surgeon said, well, that he focused in slowly on the surgeon's face, because as he said later, he knew that voices came from faces. And the face, so-called for him, was an abstract of moving shapes and boundaries and colors, completely meaningless. And he said, this is sight. In fact, he did learn a certain amount slowly. When I first visited him, there was a strange scene. He had a cat on his lap, and he was feeling the cat and glaring at it or staring at it. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm correlating the cat. And he meant that he was trying to form a visual perception which matched the tactile perception. He didn't do terribly well, and when, for unrelated causes, he lost the sight he had, he was really rather grateful. But I wouldn't sort of universalize from this, and perhaps there are people who given reasonable sight or hearing for the first time would rejoice in it. And this came up with another patient of mine. Well, I shouldn't call her a patient. We originally met, her husband was an astronaut, and we originally met at a launch party. And she remarked later that I, slightly rudely, seemed to be observing her closely. And in fact, I was observing her closely, although I didn't realize that she was observing me observing her closely, because I realized that her eyes were not quite in alignment and were to some extent moving independently. And she then told me that she had been born with a squint, and she'd had some eye surgery, and that cosmetically her eyes would pass, but functionally each one, although it had good vision, was operating independently. And one needs to correlate the vision of the two eyes to have stereoscopic vision, 3D vision. And I asked her whether she could imagine what 3D vision was like. And she said, I think so. She said, I'm a professor of neurobiology. I've read all the relevant papers. I said, well, okay. 10 years later, she sent me a letter recalling this conversation, and she said, I was wrong. She said, I can say I was wrong because now I have developed stereo vision. And she expatiated on the wonder and joy of this, and what a huge transformation it had made in her life. And she said that in fact nothing, it could not be imagined. And she, Bertrand Russell often talked about sort of the knowledge by description and knowledge by direct perception. And but in her case, she responded very well and joyously. She was a little confused for about a day. Suddenly she saw things sticking out towards her, and she didn't know how much things should be sticking out, projecting or receding visually, and she had to correlate it with her own movements. But she did this in 24 hours, and since then has loved stereo vision. And maybe we could get used to some other sorts of vision. I mean, maybe it might be nice, like some birds or insects, to detect polarized light or to see into the ultraviolet. I have a friend who had cataracts removed as a child. He was very young, and at that time they didn't use implanted lenses. And he once told me that normally our lenses cut out ultraviolet. But he told me that he could see the markings on flowers which attract bees to them, that he could see some way into the ultraviolet. And I said, what's ultraviolet like? And he said, I can no more tell you than you can tell me what stereoscopy is like. So you can't actually tell anyone what experience is like.
So that's what would happen if for people who lose senses. But if we talk more about mental function in generality, I have a colleague at the medical school of Tel Aviv who's studying the genetic basis of autism, with, as he clearly states, with the ultimate goal of curing autism. And I'm curious to what Temple Grenadine would say about that, and what you would both react to him and to her.
Well, Temple Grandin is a very intelligent autistic person, and she was probably the first autistic person who wrote an autobiography. She has sometimes been quizzed as to whether she would like to be cured, and she says, no, autism is part of who I am. It's part of my identity. And what one is dealing with one way and another is the relation of a what, a physiological condition to a who. Again, there are many deaf people who say, no, we don't want a cochlear implant. We are happy as we are. We have an entire culture, and you may call us hearing impaired, but you know, this is so I think one has to be again, it needs to be said in the case of autism that there may be many unusual powers and dispositions of mind which can be stronger in the autistic than in so-called normals, whom autistic people slightly disdainfully call neurotypical. I don't know how many of us here are autistic. It may be that we're all on the spectrum, or 50% of us are. Incidentally, it was said in Silicon Valley there was a very large number of autistic children, and it was thought that in Silicon Valley a lot of clever, mildly autistic, slightly autistic people came and married and had sort of rather severely autistic children. Finally, I think that this has to be even if any sort of cure could be made, this would have to be a completely individual decision. It can be interesting having a little experience of something like autism oneself, because if one has some magnetic stimulation to the dominant temporal lobe, abstract thought becomes somewhat more difficult, but concrete imagery and calculation can become a lot easier, and you may have a little experience of being a savant. But you can't have it both ways. Or maybe you can.
So we can talk about chemical interventions later.
Right.
But so on the one hand of the spectrum, you've worked a lot with, you know, highly functioning adults, and on the other hand, you have this fascination with earthworms. And you know, Charles Darwin also had a fascination with earthworms, and he hypothesized that worms have a mind of some kind, and that they deserve to be called intelligent. So why so, and and where did you get a fascination with earthworms?
In the garden when I was a child. Later, when I had 2 times of doing research, I'm no good as a researcher. I'm very clumsy and slightly dishonest.
You can delete that part from the video.
And on 2 occasions, earthworms were my experimental animal, and I'm afraid I made a sort of a terrible holocaust of earthworms, and I collected thousands of them because I wanted to see how their nerves were myelinated and what their brains were like. But Darwin, well, before earthworms, Darwin said of one insectivorous plant. Darwin was fascinated by plants which could close suddenly and catch insects, and which could sometimes digest insects. And he said of one of them, the sundew, he said it's not only a wonderful plant, but a most sagacious animal. And for Darwin, there was continuity through all of life, certainly through all of animal life and perhaps animal and plant life. Darwin felt that plants were very underestimated, and his last book, everyone was waiting for what will be the final work of the great man, of the genius. To what heights will he rise? And he wrote his last book on the Lowly Earthworm, and it is a wonderful book, which incidentally sold out on the day of publication. Books on earthworms don't usually sell out on the day of publication. It was partly because Darwin wrote it, but partly because it's a very charming book not least in the first 2 chapters, which are devoted to the psychology of earthworms, and so-called. And Darwin enlisted all his family to look at this. Can earthworms appreciate music? He had his wife Emma play the piano, and one of his sons played a bassoon, and Darwin himself shouted or tried to sing. No, I think earthworms are the most easily available. I think they make lovely pets. And they're easy and clean to keep in the kitchen. And they have much the same taste in some way as we do. Sort of onions and garlic are favorites of earthworms. And they can learn. And even animals simpler than earthworms.
What do you mean that earthworm can learn?
Well, they may find by experience that something is attractive or something is dangerous, and then their reactions will be different a second time. But some people are reluctant to speak of mind in any animal other than human beings, but I don't know how far it stretches down. This is not panpsychism. I don't attribute any mind to this table or to my watch, or at the moment.
Can I interrupt for a second?
To anything we make.
So how do you, when you say you don't attribute mind, can you define mind?
It would probably have to be something beyond complex adaptive behavior, or complex adaptive behavior might be the first clue to mind, perhaps sometimes we might have difficulty wondering whether a very sophisticated robot is sentient or not. I think perhaps in terms of forming some representation of the world, of its surroundings, and acting coherently in it. I'm not sure that I could define mind, but I'm prepared to acknowledge it fairly low down in the scale of creation.
So, I think our mind.
I would think in the Garden of Eden, the serpent had a mind, and it had some instructions, and it probably used a certain cunning and planning to set them in motion.
So, there's a connection between our minds and plants, and whether plants have a mind or not. It's clear that plants produce chemicals that affect our minds.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and how?
Yeah. So, if we're talking about hallucinations and reality and sensations and plants affecting our minds, you talk a lot about hallucinations in your book about hallucination. Can you talk a bit more about that and what the connection between hallucination, reality, maybe rationality?
Yeah, big questions, but I suppose there should be nothing less here. The brain is always active, as I said. If one is blindfolded for a couple of days, completely blindfolded, which is not that easy, then one will start seeing things which are not there and not real, but which you will take to be there and real, and which will be entirely distinct from your images or imagination, which you know what you're imagining. You are the creator of what you imagine, whereas with the things you start to see, you feel, who ordered them? Where do they come from? What's going on? And you realize that if you're not a supernaturalist, that some part of your brain is behaving autonomously on its own, without your consent, and not in your control. For me, I've worked mostly with elderly people, and often elderly people who are perfectly intact mentally, but who are very deaf or rather blind. And the deaf ones tend to... a hallucination is just like a perception. And if you hallucinate music, or you hallucinate a smell, if you lose a sense, you are likely, for better or worse, or you may start having hallucinations in that sense. And this is one sort of hallucination, though, as you say, and as human beings, and probably some other animals have discovered, there are all sorts of plant products which can produce hallucinations. And it seems to be part of human culture that some hallucinations are invited, whether for pleasure or for epiphany, and because they seem to have profound importance. And certainly as a physician, I should say as a patient physician, because people are often very reluctant to mention hallucinations. They're immediately often associated with losing one's mind or going mad. And I've known many people who didn't open up to me at first, and then perhaps would mention that they had some hallucinations. I think all of us here have probably had hallucinations of some kind, especially, or well, of course, if you define a dream as a hallucination. I'm having a hallucination of a cell phone. Incidentally, this is a rather common hallucination. A rather common hallucination is of a phone ringing. And if my phone rings at night, I wait to see if there'll be a second ring. If not, I know it was a hallucination. Because not everyone will ring off after one ring. But there can be very simple hallucinations, sometimes of a noise, a sight, a smell, or extremely elaborate ones of angels, of burning bushes and whatnot.
So,
I don't know why that
just
came into my mind.
One more heavy question, because I have to then ask this question. So, do you think, as a neurologist, as someone who's been exposed to many different stories, that in the end, all brain function can be explained rationally and mechanistically, or am I missing something here?
Well, I'm not sure what terms like rational or mechanistic mean. There is, as far as we know, we have not encountered anything else in the universe which has the powers or the problems of a brain. It is very difficult to make any mechanistic parallel, and in particular the current parallel with computers falls down in many, many ways. Even though one may have to allow that computation of some sorts goes on in the brain. I don't think there's anything supernatural with the brain, because I don't think there's anything supernatural with anything. But nature is very smart. I think Freeman Dyson, a great physicist, he likes to say that nature's imagination is richer than ours. Nature has no difficulty making a brain and a mind. Whether or not she does it in jellyfish, she's certainly doing it in mammals and birds and so forth. And we have no idea how this can happen. So much so that some philosophers speak of cognitive closure, that our mind does not have the capacity to imagine what sort of a, I won't say what sort of a mechanism, what sort of a thing, a process can lead to a mind. 40 years ago, consciousness was never a subject of discussion. It was a forbidden word. It was not kosher. And then in 1979, Crick wrote an article in Scientific American about that investigation of consciousness was licit. People felt if Crick of the double helix said so, then, but there are very strong divisions. There are those who feel that, another 10 years, we'll understand it all. There are others who feel that it's a much more difficult problem and it will take a couple of centuries. There are others who may feel it's no problem at all. Of course, sort of a subject and an objective, they're merely opposite sides of the same surface or sentient surface or whatever. And other people who feel this will be an ultimate mystery. I forgot the question.
No,
now.
you answered it one. No, but because it's actually fascinating, your answer, especially about computers, because I was actually quite pleased to learn that we share a love of a science fiction character whose name is Data.
Oh, yes.
And for those of you who don't know, Data is in okay, you got from Star Trek, and it's So why Data?
Data is an android. Amongst other things, I'm sorry this is irrelevant, but I am so fond of Star Trek. I once went to Los Angeles to the studios, and I met, among others, Data.
Oh my.
And I told him that he was a hero to autistic people everywhere, and he wasn't quite sure how to take that. Data has a positronic brain, whatever that is, and he is wonderful at all sorts of things, but rather movingly, he pines to be human, or to have human emotions and human frailties, and to fall in love and to fall ill, and so forth. Data is certainly an intriguing imagination of a sentient being with a with a positronic brain, and not a neural one. But I don't think any positronic or other mechanical brain, I suspect, will ever be able to match the a biological one in all sorts of ways. But who knows?
I just want to ask two last questions, because I think there'll probably be hundreds of questions coming from the audience. We'll take, but what on when the movie Awakenings came out, of your first book, how was it to have Robin Williams play you, and how, in your perception, how close did he come to the truth?
Well, I encountered him as a very friendly, genial, witty man. And we went to restaurants together and we swam together, and it didn't occur to me that all this time he was observing me minutely, though fortunately with a sympathetic eye. And it was only when we got into a conversation, and one isn't too conscious of one's gestures, but I got into what I'm told is a characteristic pensive posture. And I suddenly realized he was in the same posture. And at that point it was like suddenly having an identical but younger twin. And it startled us both. He had certainly picked up all my mannerisms, so-called, and tricks of speech and this and that. And we decided we better have some distance between us so that he would be able, out of himself, and using as to create a figure which was not an imitation or a simulacrum of me, but it was very strange and had a quality of the uncanny. I felt more comfortable with De Niro, who was portraying one of the patients. Although there again there were strange moments. I, among other things, was employed as a sort of technical consultant to advise on what Parkinson's is like, what Parkinsonism is like. And I was instructing De Niro at one point how people with Parkinson's may suddenly fall backwards because some of their balance reflexes are not there. And I was in the middle of explaining this when he suddenly fell backwards on me. And I was almost knocked over, and I was very startled. And at that moment, I thought, he's not acting. He's got it. And in fact, I then wondered whether acting Parkinsonian could make one Parkinsonian. But it was a very extraordinary experience all round. I was most pleased when one of the patients from 1969 came along to the studios, and it was the only time I ever saw De Niro lose some of his self-possession was when he had to act catatonic in front of a patient who was catatonic, and I wondered what she was thinking, but she was able to make a tiny thumbs up sign, meaning he's okay. But anyhow, it was very odd. It was very odd finding myself, or a version of myself, enacted.
So what's next? What's your next project?
Well, there are three of them at the moment, or at least, or maybe they'll all go together. When I was 60, I had a sudden flood of reminiscences relating to early life, and these eventuated in Uncle Tungsten. And when I had my 80th birthday last year, this also seemed to release a flood of reminiscences. And so I've been trying to catch up on the last 65 years, because Uncle Tungsten really ended at the age of 15. I'm not writing a coherent... it's a little like a photograph album, except this is going to be an album of memories and reminiscences. So that is in process, but also a book on essays, which includes the one on earthworms, and of course case histories. And so I have 3 growing piles of manuscript, and sometimes I'm not quite sure what belongs where.
And where do you fit in your practice?
I do fit that in a little bit as well.
Amazing. So I think I'll stop here with the structured questions, and if you're okay with that, we'll go to questions from the audience. And there's might be some problems in hearing, so I might have to relay the question up forward. So anyone has any questions? Sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. I'm bringing a question of a friend of mine who's a child psychologist who can't be here. She was very disappointed. She asked if what we know about brains of children who are growing up today, who we call the screen children, that their eyes are in the screens and in the tablets. Often their parents have their eyes in the screens and the tablets, and there are many people now who are growing up with much less eye contact than they had before, and than previous generations had. What do you have to say about how that can affect the development of the brain?
I may have missed a few words because
it's about how growing up without eye contact, because we're always in the screen.
Yeah. I'm not sure yet how it is in Israel, but in New York, 4/5, 9/10, a majority of people are walking around with their eyes fixed like this. They often bump into you. They often get killed by cars. They don't. They're very rude. Well, perhaps that's the wrong word, but they don't respond to social cues, and and although one speaks of a world of extreme connection and hyperconnection, you can also see it as a world of bizarre disconnection, and I fear for it a little bit. But this may be an old-fashioned fear, because I grew up in a time when people looked at each other and were conscious of each other, not through a screen. But now, 3 billion people, or whatever half the world's population are looking at screens. It'll certainly be making fascinating changes to the brain, as there are big changes in the brain of those who become literate. The big differences in the brains of the literate and the illiterate. Incidentally, sort of, Sophocles was against writing. He thought that writing would be bad for people's memory and people's conversation. But I think intriguing and physiological and psychological and social problems have arisen in the last 20 years, and which have altered society more in the last 20 years than the previous 10,000.
Hello. I have a question about the hallucinations.
It's on. You just have to hold it close.
Okay. I have a question about the hallucinations arising in people who are blindfolded for 3 days, say. Those hallucinations being completely disconnected from reality, and one doesn't know where they come from. How do you relate that phenomenon to the phenomenon of dreams? Are they connected, similar, or are they of an entirely different kind?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and very early on, I asked one of my almost blind patients who had visual hallucinations. I said, "Are they like dreams?" And she said, "Not in the least." She said they're like bits of film, which are suddenly shown, or you come into a theatre and you see a bit of film going on. In dreams, you are part of the dream, implicitly or explicitly. You are entirely absorbed in the dream. There is no consciousness outside the dreaming consciousness. Whereas not with all hallucinations, but with most hallucinations, and the sort I'm talking about, there is an acute, lucid, puzzled, intrigued observer who says something is going on with my brain or whatever. But of course, in sleep, the senses are disconnected, the motor system is disconnected, the brain is free in a way to do what it wants, and so there is perhaps a certain analogy between dreaming and hallucinations that way, in that both entail a released or autonomously stimulated functions of the brain.
I studied music in my youth, and I remember being told about how the harmonies that are pleasing to the Western ear conform to simple mathematical ratios. So the quinta and the terza and the octave and so on stand to each other in these simple integer relationships. Yet your book music, Ophelia, says that you don't believe there is any neurological basis underlying any of the different tonal systems existing in the world.
It does? Well, no, certainly the octave and the fifth and other intervals which Pythagoras wrote about correspond to harmonic ratios of one sort and another. But I think there are clearly strong and, in a way, idiosyncratic cultural variations, so that the Hindu scale of 22 notes or whatever is somewhat alien to, well, certainly to our even-tempered scales. I think as with so much, there are some physiological constants which we then build on culturally. There's been some discussion as to why, at least to Western ears, major modes often seem to be happy and minor modes to be rather sad. Although, of course, nothing has more gaiety than Mendelssohn's violin concerto in E minor. I mean, he can make a minor key sound extremely happy. I don't know how to address this better. But certainly without intervals, tonal intervals, I don't think one could have music. You can have some glissandos up and down, but you get tired of those after a while. And again, other than tone, rhythm is essential to music, and the beat. And this seems to be a largely human thing. From early childhood, people will respond to heard or imagined music, and no other primate does that. Apes and chimpanzees can't respond to the beat. Only human, most. Sorry. Well, I was about to say once when I said this, a woman in the audience said, "Now I realize why I've got nowhere." She said she'd been trying to teach her dog how to dance for 5 years, but she got nowhere. But as you say, parrots and some songbirds will respond to the beat, and there's some also some thought that whales and porpoises may do so, but it's not common. But responding to the beat seems to be a universal human, and maybe it was very important in prehistory, in bonding people and bringing them together, as it still is. We sing together, we bench together, we daven together.
You mentioned in Uncle Tungsten your experience as a child being sent away from home during the Blitz. And I understand that led you to feel like the anthropologist from Mars. Could you say something more?
Well, there was once a radio program in which all the interviewees were people who had been, of my generation, who had been sent away in the war, and some of them had had very, very bad experiences. There was one man in particular who seemed to have had a fairly successful and happy life, but he said, however, that he thought he was deficient in the 3 B's. And the interviewer said, "What are the 3 B's?" And he said, bonding, belief, and the third one is escaping me. Or that was, sorry?
Belonging.
Belonging, belief, and bonding. Yeah. And I always tend to forget one of the B's. And I think I may have, I feel to some extent, I may have lived some of my life at a cautious distance, although this doesn't apply in many ways. I've often felt very close to patients, but there paradoxically, the formality of the relationship allows an intimacy. But I think I think parents were ill-advised. I mean, there's a general feeling that parents were ill-advised in 1939 to send their children away, and it might have been better, though it sounds a monstrous thing to say, to have shared the dangers of life in London with the family, than being separated, sometimes for years, to be physically safe. But a mark is left.
This is really a question for both Professor Chamovitz and Dr. Sachs. I sort of intuited or heard in the discussion of consciousness a more mechanistic direction from Professor Chamovitz, and perhaps a more wondrous attitude from Dr. Sachs. I'd like to ask both of you, for example, was related to this Mr. Data, yes. Do you think do you have a perfectly naturalistic, or do you think, let's put it this way, do you think a computer, no matter how complex, you can make it as complex as you want, could a computer enjoy something? Enjoy? What do the two of you think?
I'll let you take that.
Well,
The question was about, sorry, just for those who couldn't hear, it was talking about consciousness and mechanistically versus something else. And going back to Mr. Data, could a computer actually enjoy something?
When I was 15, I saw an artificial animal developed by a man called Grey Walter many years ago. It was a sort of primitive electronic tortoise, and certain values had been built in so that the tortoise was attracted to lights and would avoid shadows, and when its battery was running out, it would recharge itself. This has some analogy to what you see, for example, in bacteria, or people for that matter, who are attracted to light and away from the darkness. We have feelings, and Sherrington, who was a great physiologist, once imagined that insects were in an ocean of affect, as he put it. I think pain and pleasure and fear and pleasurable anticipation almost have to be built into, well, I was going to say have to be built into organisms, but then at this point, what do you feel about your plants?
Yeah, so I want to talk about, well, it's actually very interesting that you asked about robots, because I have a friend who's a professor of robotics at the University of Bristol, or University of West England in Bristol, or something like that, who's building an ethical robot.
Yeah.
And I just heard a fascinating lecture about him, what would be an ethical robot. And I had a little problem with the wording, but even if we talk about plants, I think we have to understand that when we use the word enjoy, or when we use words like suffering, we're talking about subjectivity.
Yeah, that's it.
And subjectivity is, what's painful what's suffering for somebody is just annoying for somebody else. So I don't think that, when I talk about a plant, I don't think a plant suffers. And I don't think a plant, we plant biologists say, wow, our plants are enjoying the sunlight today. They're really, they're really happy with this new fertilizer we've given them. This is our own subjective definition of their experience, which is anthropomorphizing. I think neurobiologists, and correct me if I'm wrong, have identified that subjectivity, suffering, necessitates a frontal cortex. That while the pain centers are deep there's a difference between pain and suffering.
Mm-hmm.
That suffering necessitates both an emotional and a physical impetus. And so in the absence of a frontal cortex, I think by definition, there can't be subjectivity. There can't be suffering and there can't be enjoyment. And so, of course, my plants are not enjoying. They're not, and they're also not suffering. One person read my book and said, "Oh my God, my daughter has nothing to eat anymore." Because, if plants have senses, then that means they're suffering when if they know that we're touching them, she's going to stop being a vegan and eat nothing. So keep going eating your plants. Yes, they know that when they're being touched, but they don't give a damn. So I think subjectivity is something specific to organisms with a developed frontal cortex, which are not only humans.
Well, I would. I think.
I think eventually, theoretically, we could. I think we could program it. I think we could.
Well, I want to say there's something between a frontal cortex and a plant. Namely the rest of animal creation. And say in particular, an octopus, which has 500 million nerve cells, can not only be a very good and quick learner, but seems to have many affective states which it will signal sometimes to others. I was very struck this morning. When I visited a cousin of mine, there was a dog, and after I tickled the dog, it turned over and gave me its belly to rub. You can see exactly such behavior in an octopus who gets to know its keeper, and when the aquarium keeper approaches, the octopus may turn over and want its belly rubbed. I think you can have a content octopus. Now, an octopus has a really complex brain, and there was a fascinating book called A Model of the Brain in 1960, which was built on sort of studies of octopus neurology and psychology. You can have a brain built very differently from a vertebrate, let alone a mammalian brain, and it may not have, but you may have a functional analog of frontal cortex. And I don't know how low this goes on the scale of animal creation.
Can I add something to that? Even though I think it's fascinating that we sometimes get stuck in our own picture of what a brain and a response is, when clearly what an octopus has these with a different brain. And even if we go back to the plant world, where a plant is obviously aware of the color of the light, the direction of the light, the smells of its neighbors, the temperature of the outside, who's touched it, and remembers past events, and integrates all of this, all in the absence of a brain. So I think the bottom line is that through an organism, in order to survive, has to integrate information. A nervous system is one adaptation for this integration. But integration does not necessitate the human brain. Which leads me to a question, if I may. Maybe it's a self-serving question. As educators, do plants, I think right now, also at Hebrew University, you founded a program in what it's called brain sciences. Do brain scientists, neurobiologists, have anything to learn from plant biology?
I think they probably do. And they have a lot to learn from zoologists and probably from botanists, and probably also in another direction from philosophers. And they all need to come together. If I may go back, Robert John, for a moment to your thought. The late Gerald Edelman, who to my mind was the profoundest neurobiologist of his generation, and who was the first to provide an extremely comprehensive biological theory of consciousness, and one testable at many, many different levels. Edelman liked to make, or did make, and design a series of what he called noetic automata. He was at pains to say that these were not robots. They had not been programmed. They didn't have any instructions. They were given some sensors or receptors, and they had certain values or goals built into them. And their processing was done with the aid of supercomputers, which would also allow one to see exactly what was going on. And basically these animals, which he called Darwins, without any programming, would gradually build up, and very idiosyncratically and individually, representations of the world, of their playpen, which might become more and more complex. Edelman was up to Darwin 12. I mean, I think he himself was like a Darwin 50. But Edelman did feel that consciousness and sensibility, that given a, I don't know what term to use. I hesitate to use the word machine or computer, and I hesitate to use the word organism. But given a thing of sufficient complexity, in a world of sufficient complexity and with various goals, then something like consciousness and sensibility and subjectivity would be reached.
I think, I think that's a profound statement. I think we're maybe, I hate to disappoint everybody, but I think this is a wonderful thought to go on. And I would like one request, that your next trip not be 60 years, and so that we could come back and continue this dialogue again, hopefully much sooner. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay. Thank you. And Danny, thank you very much for being the other half of the dialogue. Okay.